Good morning, everybody. We're about to get started with the next panel. So Nancy Qian from I'm Susan Aronson from GWU, and so I'm going to introduce Nancy Chen from Northwestern University.
Thanks a lot for having me. I just ran into Hui in the corridor, and he reminded me that after the birth of my first child, the first conference I went to was a China MBR workshop, where I saw Haiming speak. And now this is the first conference after my second child, which I just had a few months ago. So either I'm very dedicated to China conferences, or I'm a great fan of listening to Haiming speak. I think it's actually both. But anyways, let me get to the talk. So this talk is called The Dynamic Effects of Computerized VAT Invoices on Chinese Manufacturing Firms. So several of you had heard much earlier versions of this, and hopefully we've made some progress since then. This is a co-authored work with two professors at Fudan University and a graduate student at Yale. All right, let me jump right into it. So, our motivation is pretty simple. All governments tax, which for, China, the US, everybody has to tax. And when you want people to give you taxes, you face two problems, right? These problems are ubiquitous. First is the enforcement, like how do I get people to give me their money? The second is consequences. By getting people to pay me taxes, am I causing any type of economic distortions? How are individuals and firms responding to the fact that they have to give me a percentage of their earning? Now, this paper is focused on answering the second question, and there is actually a vast literature, as many of you know, in public economics, that's looking at the second question. What are the impact of taxes on a whole range of outcomes? However, almost all of these studies have been focusing on the short run. They look at short run elasticities. And part of the reason is data, and part of the reason is identification. It's very hard to find a setting where we can look at the long run dynamic effects. And that's one of the really neat things about the computerization of VAT invoices in China. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the short and longer run effects of increasing VAT enforcement, increasing VAT payment on Chinese manufacturing firms. This is interesting for a couple of different reasons. So there was a general motivation I gave earlier, but then there's also the specific context. VATs are a very important source of tax revenues in many countries, and particularly developing countries. So in China in 2002, I think this is a peak. This is a year where VATs contributed the most to state revenue. VATs accounted for 47% of all state revenue for the entire People's Republic of China. So this is a huge source of revenue. So that's one reason why VAT is interesting. So why is it so important for China and other developing countries? Because theoretically VAT is self-enforcing, right? So VAT is something, VAT is a value-added tax. It's the difference between your sales and your input cost. And what this means is that while upstream firms are incentivized to understate sales, downstream firms are incentivized to overstate sales. So upstream and downstream firms, in principle, they should monitor each other, right? If you sell to me and you want to understate your sales, well, I don't really want to let you get away with that, because if you understate your sales, I have to understate my input costs, which means I have to pay higher VAT. So I'm not going to understate my input costs, so you can't understate your sales. That's how it works. So this is great in theory. In practice, for this to actually be implemented, for it to actually work and be binding, these invoices have to leak, right? The transaction that I just described, if the government doesn't have records of that transaction, if they don't have the invoice from Haiming's firm and my firm, then they can't link it. So, theory is fine, the theory, but in practice it's not executable. So, and of course the second part of the problem is that if you find an unlinked invoice, if there is a problem, the government has to be able to publish the abater. So in the case of China, we're not really worried about the ability to punish. We're more worried about the ability to link these sales. And so what happened in 2001 and 2002 is this massive, we call it a reform, but it's really a technological introduction, right? I'm just going to use reform because that's a word we use a lot when we evaluate policies in economics. But really, this policy reform. Nothing really changed in terms of law, just the technology got a little bit better. And so before, all of these invoices were linked by hand, which actually effectively they just weren't being linked. They were taken and nothing happened to them. But in 2001 and 2002, everything got computerized. There was a big digital database, and the invoices got computerized, so everything got automatically linked. So if you wanted to simplify what happened, enforcement went from very, very little, almost nothing, to almost perfect. Right? And it's almost and almost because there's always a little bit of deviation that I'll describe a bit more later. Okay. Now, so just to sum up, what are we going to do? We're going to study the effect of this massive improvement in the ability of the government to enforce VAT payment on VAT payment and on other outcomes for the firm, like sales, input, output, productivity, so on and so forth. And we're going to look for 7 years after the reform. So we're going to look at every year within 7 years. And 7 years is just because of data limitation. All right, so the study has been hard. It's been a long time in coming and difficult along the way, mostly because of a lack of understanding of the details of the Chinese tax system. There hasn't been much written. I mean, practitioners know what's going on, but academics know much less of what's going on, especially the average picture. Just because there hasn't been that much written in Chinese or English about the details of the tax system in terms of implementation. And secondly, the second difficulty is that data was very difficult. Administrative tax data from China doesn't really exist for the context that we're looking at. And finally, there's this generic problem of causal identification. So the principal contribution of our paper is to try to address all three of these limitations and estimate the effect of computerization on firms in the short and longer run. Right. So what do we do exactly? Well, instead of using administrative tax data, which we can't get, I've never seen anyone get it. I've seen surveys of tax data. I haven't actually seen administrative tax data. So instead of getting administrative tax data, what we're going to observe are tax paid by firms in the Census of Manufacturing survey. So this is survey data. So the firms are saying, how much taxes am I paying? And we believe that this is pretty accurate. There's going to be some random noise, but we don't think, there's no reason to think that there's systematic error, because the people who are collecting the manufacturing census are totally unrelated to people who are collecting taxes. But I'm happy to discuss caveats or concerns about that later, or after the talk. The second thing we did is, in order to understand the Chinese tax system, we did and I want to say exhaustive, but that's not true. It's not an exhaustive effort, it's more like an exhausting effort. We exerted an exhausting amount of energy to understand the Chinese tax system in detail, on paper. We read every single white paper we could get our hands on in Chinese and English, there's not much in English, in China, in the US. We interviewed dozens, at this point hundreds, of tax collectors, tax officials, and firm managers. And we read every academic paper we could get our hands on in China and the US. So this took about 2 to 3 years, this rather exhausting but not, and hopefully exhaustive effort. And what we learned is we learned a lot, but I think the key facts to take away from our project is that prior to computerization, no matter what was written down on the white papers, in practice, there was almost no enforcement. There was very little selective enforcement. And the audits were manual, and they focused on high deductible sectors. And I'm also happy to talk about that, or speculate why that is, like after the talk. But these were the stylized facts that we got from all of our background research. And this is important for us because this is what we're going to exploit for identification strategy. In order to understand the impact of computerization, we're going to compare outcomes before and after computerization between sectors that were high deductible sectors and sectors that were low deductible sectors, right? It's a simple diff and diff. And already I'll tell you, this is the best we could come up with, It's not a perfect strategy because we don't have a perfect control group. Everyone is affected a little bit. We're just comparing the more affected and the less affected. And so you should think of whatever estimates I give you as like an understatement of the true effect. Okay, it's a short talk, so I won't preview and I won't talk about the literature. Okay, let me talk a little bit about some necessary background facts. This is a short talk, so this is on a need-to-know basis. VAT was first introduced in China in 1994. The formula for VAT has not changed since that time. VAT is a flat tax. It's 17% of your value added, which is literally your sales minus your deductible inputs. So what are deductible inputs? Well, you get full deductions on manufactured inputs, repair inputs, retail inputs, wholesale inputs, and these things will come with special VAT invoices, right? And then you get partial deductions in agricultural products. Interestingly, until 2009, when the system was overhauled again, there was no deductions for labor costs, fixed assets, capital depreciation, abnormal losses, rent, fringe benefits, interest from bank loans, and overhead and operating expenses. And the period we're looking at, our data ends in 2007, so this 2009 overhaul doesn't affect our study. And I'm only mentioning it here because as I present the results, a lot of you will be thinking about caveats and omitted variables, which are really important, obviously. And knowing what's deductible and not deductible, I think will put some discipline on the omitted variables and the sectors that we're worried about or not worried about. So before 2001, the government issued official receipts for sales and purchases of all VAT inputs. Actually, the government has always done this. The main difference is that before 2001, everything was manually administered. You get a paper copy of everything, you fill everything out by paper, you give it to someone, a tax official, who then takes it to an office, and to the extent that they document any data, they're doing it by hand. So this is prone to both errors, just human errors, as well as intentional invasion. It was really very costly for officials to manually link information from all the invoices. Again, China is a big country. There are a lot of firms, and these aren't firm level data. This is transaction level data for the firms, right? So we're talking about billions and billions of receipts. And what that meant was that effectively, there was almost no enforcement anywhere. People just didn't enforce. I mean, it's impossible to manually enforce this if you just think about it. To the extent, but of course, the Chinese government hires tens of thousands of tax officials, if not hundreds of thousands. What are they doing? Well, they're doing very limited auditing of sectors with very high shares of deductibles. And this is because that there was this belief in China, as well as in many other developing countries, that where the government loses the most money are on the sectors with a lot of deductibles. Right? I don't know if this is true or not, but this was a prevailing belief amongst tax officials. So what that meant was that when they did audit, they focused on firms and sectors that had much higher, the official instructions in the white paper is that you should look at a firm, and if their VAT share, which is VAT divided by sales, was too high or too low relative to the region sector mean, then you should audit them. But the region definition was vague. And when we talked to tax officials, they said they didn't even have data on the region sector mean. Like, what does a region sector mean? Like, it's the sector mean for your city for last year. No one provided them with this data. And so this was like they couldn't really implement this particular benchmarking. And what they did instead was to follow a rule of thumb, which was a shortcut. And they had aggregate national data, right? And they said, well, looking at this aggregate national data, what's a sector with high VAT share? And we'll just target all the firms in our region that nationally are in high VAT sectors. So we weren't able to substantiate these claims with audit data because, as far as we know, there is no audit data, at least that are not available to researchers, but we will substantiate this with personnel data from the tax bureau later. Okay, what happened in 2001? So in 2001, all invoices were computerized. I won't describe the details to you just because we don't have a lot of time, but the point is that it made it very difficult to evade. Evasion is still possible, but it's really, really hard. Essentially, your whole production chain has to, all your upstream and downstream sellers, everybody in the chain of receipts has to opt out. So you can buy black market receipts. So actually, my co-authors and I, we bought some just to see what they look like. But they don't look that, most of them just don't look that great, right? So the ones that are passable would be the ones that say Haimin's firm got issued officially and he didn't use, and then he can sell it to me. So that evasion is possible. But as you can imagine, that's a little bit hard. So that happened, but evasion still went down. Okay. And then the other thing to note is that during our study period, nothing else really happened to the tax system. Things did happen later in 2009 and 2013, but not during our period. So very quickly, just to verify, was it true that the places that the firms with the firms and sectors that were high VAT share nationally were audited more? We took data on the number of tax officials in a province and year, and we looked and see how that correlated with the VAT, the average VAT share in that province year. And we find that indeed it is highly negatively correlated. The higher VAT share you were, the fewer tax officials you had. And then, so that makes sense. And then the other things also make sense, right? Like if you're in a bigger province, you have more tax officials, more people, more tax officials, more firms, more tax officials. So the data everything sort of makes sense so far. Okay, I'll come back to the caveats when we talk about robustness. So again, what we do is a simple difference in difference. We compare outcomes before and after the reform between high VAT and low VAT share sectors. And how do we measure VAT share? VAT share is sales minus inputs divided by sales times 0.17, because that's the tax rate. And then the question is, how do you measure tax rate? Measurement error is actually a big problem. So do we use the VAT share data from the firm survey? Well, we don't want to do that, because after 2001, that's an outcome of our reform, and that's not right. And we don't really want to use the pre-reform data because that measures true VAT obligations and evasion. So that's not right either. So one possibility is we can use Chinese input-output tables. So this is good because maybe you think it's a little before the reform, because maybe it doesn't get evasion as much, but how do we know, right? So the second possibility is a proxy with US data. So we can use US input-output tables to calculate proxy VAT share for each sector in China. And one thing you might worry about is maybe US VAT shares aren't the same as Chinese VAT shares, but we're going to look at the data. And surprisingly, I mean, actually not that surprisingly, all of our results look very similar no matter which measure we use. In the paper we show you the results with everything. Here I'll just stick to the US, the US proxy. Okay. So just because I don't have that much time, I have 10 more minutes, is that right? Please. Okay. I can just go on forever. No, I think I have 10 more minutes. So because I don't have a lot of time, I'll just kind of blitz through the things that aren't super important, like the sources of our data. So what is important? One is I'm going to show you that the VAT share that we calculate from US input-output tables are actually highly positively correlated from the Chinese input-output tables. And in both cases, we're using pre-reform data, right? Because you might worry that if we use input-output tables in either countries after 2001, this could be affected by the reform. So it turns out that it's highly correlated, and it's also highly correlated with the firm data. If we just look at the VAT share that we get from the manufacturing surveys, it's also positively correlated with both measures. So once you see this, it's not surprising or controversial that our estimates are pretty much similar, no matter which measure we use. So measurement error, which we were really worried about ex ante, turned out not to be a huge problem ex post. Okay, so this figure is very important because it's just this is very easy to understand. It's just a raw plot of the data. This is how much VAT, this is the amount of VAT that's being paid by firms, and we take the average of firms in the high VAT share sectors and the average of VAT for firms in the low VAT share sector. So the red is the high and the blue is the low. And we've kind of shifted things so that it's easy to compare. And what you see is that over time, before the reform in 2001, that vertical gray line, they're kind of right on top of each other. They're moving together. So we definitely have parallel trends. And after 2001 and 2002, when the reform is being rolled out, they start to diverge, right? And it's slow because the things are getting rolled out. But by 2003, they have diverged and they continue to diverge. But then the interesting thing is by 2006 and 2007, we see a convergence. With this, our difference in difference estimates is simply going to be a mechanical, it's going to be a mechanical, there's a mechanical relationship between that and this figure, right? We're going to take the difference, the vertical gap between the red and blue line after the reform, and we're going to subtract the vertical gap in the red and blue line from before the reform. Since before the blue reform we know it's 0, so really we're just going to calculate the red and blue line after the reform. And the only point of doing a difference in difference estimate is I'm going to tell you that that gap is statistically significant. And I'll tell you when it's significant and when it's not significant. But from this figure, you kind of see that the VAT, the computerization, increased VAT payments from the high VAT share firms in the short run. And in the long run, it's going to come down a little bit. Okay. So let's look at the regression results. And I divided, we have 7 years after the reform. So, just for simplicity, we divided it into 3 groups, 2 years, 3 years, 2 years. The inset doesn't really change if we change the groupings. And column 1 just shows you the empirical estimates of the figure that you just saw. And it says that right after the reform in 2001 and 2002, we don't see a huge difference. So when the reform is being rolled out in 2001 and 2002, we don't see a huge difference in VAT share between the high and low share sectors, the treatment and control sectors. However, in the 3 years afterward, 2003, 4, and 5, we see a big difference, and it's statistically significant at the 5% level. If we go another 2 years, that difference comes down, and what we see, it's not statistically different from 0 anymore. It's much smaller in magnitude in the second year, and the p-value at the very bottom of the table tells you that it's almost statistically different from the second period, almost. Like at the 11%, not quite, at the 10%. Okay, so in column 2, we look at VAT as a share of sales, right? Because a lot of China is really growing. So if firms are just growing more, they're going to pay more VATs. So if it's really a story about enforcement, not only should VAT go up, VAT as a share of sales should go up. How much it should go up is unclear because an increase in improvement in enforcement will actually increase sales numbers. Right, so this isn't, we can't tell how much it should go up, but it should go up, and indeed it does go up, right? And in this case, we see that we get statistically significant estimates for the second and third period, but again, the third period is smaller. So I can show you the figures, we see no proof trends, but that's no surprise after looking at the means. So now let's look at a couple of other outcomes in our final few minutes. So we can look at productivity measured in different ways. We can look at Qian, we can look at DeLocker, I can never pronounce the last name, so the DLW, which is just for endogenous inputs. However, we look at it, we see that there's a smaller no effect in the first years, but then TFPR actually goes up. So TFPR, the way that they measure the way that TFPR measured, it's essentially the pre-tax price. So there's a mechanical relationship between the pre-tax price and TFPR. I just want you to keep that in mind when you interpret this as productivity. So I don't want to interpret this as productivity in the macro sense. I want to interpret it in an accounting sense. What these results show us is that when we look and see these papers that say productivity in China have really increased in the last few years, what this tells us is that a large part of the increase is driven by the improvement in VAT collection, right? It's like an accounting increase. Okay, and the interesting thing is when we look at sales, these are revenues for firms, revenues actually go down. So we've increased taxes and revenues have gone, we've increased tax payments, increased productivity, and revenues have gone down, right? We look at other inputs, it's really hard to measure labor, so we see negative effects, but it's not significant. When we look at intermediate inputs, we said intermediate inputs are going down, and it's significant. Even if we focus on column 5, which are deductible inputs, right? So it can't be evasion and lying, because if they want to pay less VAT after computerization, they should exaggerate their deductible inputs. So the fact that it's going down and the fact that sales is going down, we're really seeing a picture of firms contracting in the long run in response to the tax hike. Okay, so there are caveats to this identification strategy. We do a lot. Again, exhausting, but perhaps not exhaustive, so I have robustness checks. In this case, I would say exhaustive. We look at corporate income tax. There's no effect on other types of taxes. And what we're doing now is we were able to collect the universe of registered firms in China. So we have the roster of all registered firms, and we're trying to see if there's an effect on entry and exit, because manufacturing census are only above-scale manufacturing firms. And our current results show us that VAT, this improvement in VAT collection reduces both exit and entry of registered firms in China. And that makes sense, right? Because once you're in the system, you can't just get out, right? Because you'll be caught. But maybe you don't want to enter the system because then you'll have to pay taxes. Okay, so let me conclude in my last minute, which is that I think the results are pretty striking and simple, which is that our results support the literature. In the short run, taxes go up and we don't see any downside effects. Nothing changes. Sales doesn't change, inputs doesn't change. In the medium and longer run, we see big responses. Taxes go up and taxes keep going up. They have to pay even more taxes. And then firms start to readjust. They start to contract sales. They hire fewer people. They put in fewer inputs. And then in the long run, because of the contraction, taxes actually come down again because the firms have contracted. So what this means for policy is something that's not really surprising to economists, but I think we haven't seen empirically yet. There is a trade-off. There is a trade-off. You can increase taxes, and this will increase your revenues, but firms will adjust. And and the net effect on tax revenues is really an empirical question. It depends on the underlying elasticities. Okay, thank you.
What I'm about to present is actually really work in progress. Like Nancy was mentioning, this has been an exhausting project, but it's not nearly exhaustive. So what I will present basically is a possible story and some observations. And this is joint work with a big team, with Laura Farrow at Harvard Business School, Kathy, my former student, Junjie at UIBE, and Claudia Stanwetter at MIT Sloan. This is my first historical project. Probably it's going to be my last. But with the gloomy reality, we decided to resort to history. The paper is really about the interplay between institutions and firms in Shanghai's concession era. So let me first explain a little bit about the title. My co-author really wanted to include this line, so we include it in the title. It's the motto of Shanghai Municipal Council, on the seal of Shanghai Municipal Council back in the concession era. It means all joined in one, Omnia, Juncta in uno. Okay, so Shanghai economy between 1842 and 1942. Shanghai experienced dramatic opening from a small, relatively closed market before 1840 to a major port city in 1842 due to the Nanking Treaty, 19条约. And then also became an investment destination, especially after 1895, after the establishment of 马关条约. By 1936, it became one of the largest cities in the world and a commercial center of East Asia with over 3 million inhabitants. It's often called Paris of the East. It exhibited remarkable openness to trade, investment, and immigrants. It is also a period with some of the greatest world historical events, right? The World War, the two World Wars, the Great Depression, Japan's invasion, and many more. It had strong linkages with major nations around the world, and these linkages were transmitting shocks, including trade shocks, financial shocks, and technology shocks, and institutional shocks between the rest of the world and China. Okay, but what about the institutional side of Shanghai? As many of us here know, right, I think few actually came from Shanghai. Shanghai was also a city of multiple governments and institutions during that era, right? So this is a map of Shanghai at the time, which was much smaller than the current city, but it was divided to 3 areas, right? The old city is sort of like the domestic, the area governed by the Chinese institution, okay? The international settlement, which is the biggest area in Shanghai at the time, was governed by was basically the English American, with German, some participation, is the public settlement area, okay? And then the French concession, governed by the French side, okay? So this is a city, right, that features multiple governance institutions. It has a coexistence and competition of multiple political and economic powers in one city, which is a very unique feature of the historical context. It's a Chinese soil governed by foreigners in a way. It has international settlement and French concession. In the international settlement area, it's governed by the Shanghai Municipal Council. On the French concession side, it's governed by the Consulate General of France. Okay? In the meantime, it also has a coexistence of competition, many institutions, not just governments, but also institutions. It has formal institutions, informal institutions, domestic institutions, foreign institutions, extraterritoriality institutions, and non-extraterritoriality institutions. Okay, I'll get into those details later. The Chinese businesses were dependent on informal institutions, the family ties, the social networks, the customs, and the officials in charge, right? There were very weak formal institutions. The foreign businesses and the nationals were sort of governed by the unequal treaties signed between China and the treaty nations, right, which have the most favored nation clause, and very importantly, the extraterritorial rights to treaty nations, okay? As a result, these individual businesses were subject to an array of different institutions. Now, since we are in the middle of a trade war, I was particularly pleasantly surprised when I discovered that there was a US-China trade agreement signed in 1903. So we should keep that in mind as we discuss the current situation. It's called Treaty between the United States and China for the extension of the commercial relations between them. Long name. Signed in 1903. The tariff rate specified in that agreement was not to exceed 7%. Okay. Previously it was 5%, but the US voluntarily allowed Chinese government to raise tariff to no more than 7% to compensate for the loss of Chinese government revenue in abolishing the tax. Okay? The import duty rebate was also offered to imported content, which is a very important sector, for machine-made cotton yarn and cloth. It has most favored nation treatment, so everybody who has most favored nation or treaty with China would get that same treatment. More importantly, if you compare this agreement with the agreement signed a year ago between the UK and China, there's one major difference, and that is the IP provisions, right? I was surprised to see the US insistence in including IP provisions back more than 100 years ago, okay? So this is the one major difference between the UK Sino agreement and the US Sino agreement. It has multiple articles: protection of trademarks, protection of patents, protection of copyrights. And then lastly, there is an article about how on the reform of the judicial system in China in order for the US and other treaty nations to abolish the extraterritorial rights. Okay, so China has all the incentives to establish its own legal system so that foreign nations would abolish their extraterritorial rights. Okay, so this is just to show you the protection of patents and protection of copyrights, actually a couple pages long in the agreement. Okay, so the question that we are hoping to answer in this project, we have not managed to answer that yet, is how foreign powers and world institutions influence firm growth, organization, and the ability to respond to external shocks. Okay, there's extensive literature on the relationship between institutions and economic growth. However, most of the studies have relied on a cross-country comparison, over time, right? One caveat of this approach is countries' differences in institutions often are correlated with other characteristics of the countries, right? Economic characteristics that are not controlled for. So it's very difficult to identify the causal effect of institution on economic growth. That's why we think Shanghai's concession era offers a very unique context for us to study the role of institutions while controlling for everything happening at the same time, because it's in one city, not cross countries. Okay. All right. So just to give you, well, in contrast to today's experience of multinational firms in China, Shanghai's concession era actually produced many very successful multinational firms around the world. One example is the AIG, okay, the American International Group. The Californian-born Mr. Starr arrived at Shanghai in November 1919, and he launched his first insurance agency called AAU, offering fire and marine coverage. In 1921, he started a life insurance company called Asian Life Insurance Company. Within 10 years, he had insurance offices all across East Asia. And the business obviously became very successful in the decades to come. And Starr was also often elected as one of the 2 American members of the Shanghai Municipal Council. Okay? And Starr was convinced that the growth of his businesses was fueled by his focus on hiring, training, and promoting local people to managerial positions and putting Chinese people on his board. Okay? So this was AIG in 1919, our data set, which is small. And this is AIG in 1929, within 10 years, which has gotten a lot bigger in terms of the list of employees. Another example is HSBC. We all know this company, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, right? The founding member of HSBC was started in 1868 in Shanghai, and this is the entry back then in 1870, and then this is 1941. HSBC in Shanghai, Shanghai's branch, which is extensive list of non-production employees already. Okay. This next example, Sassoon family. I don't know how many of you know the Sassoon family, right? The Sassoon family actually sent 7 of his 8 male sons to Shanghai during that time because of the importance of Chinese market, and they engaged in China trade, right? They exported opium and metals to China, and then imported silk and tea from China into India. And then, guess what? The Tata Group was also heavily involved in Shanghai at the time, the famous Indian Tata Group. Okay? All right, and domestic example, Rong Zongjing, many Chinese here. Rong Zongjing, the Rong family, arrived in Shanghai in 1884 at the age of 14, and then he quickly established his first content mill in Shanghai. And by 1932, that content mill had a workforce of 31,000 workers, the largest employer in Shanghai at the time. And then one of his 7 sons, Rong Yiren, in 1979 founded CITIC, China International Trust Investment Corporation, became one of the largest conglomerates in Shanghai. Okay, so now let's get into the governance. So the public concession side, I'm not going to go through the timeline because I run out of time, but this is the evolution of the public concession, the governance there. The key governance institution is the Shanghai Municipal Council, SMC, and the mixed court. Okay, and then this is a picture of Nanking Road, which was part of the international settlement, and is still today one of the business roads in Shanghai. And the French concession was also following this sort of much simpler timeline. Okay, but the difference is it was ruled by the Consular General of France. Okay, so this is a picture of French Municipal Council. So the main difference is that on the public concession side, right, it was British dominated until late 1920s, and by 1930s, then the council became a lot more diversified with 5 seats from the British side, 2 American seats, 2 Japanese seats, and Chinese were allowed to join the council after 1928. Okay, it has very functional, all these public services, and land regulation served as the main constitution for FMC. The French concession was dictated by the Consul General of France in Shanghai. Okay, now one key element of the institution that we want to emphasize in this project is the extraterritoriality. The extraterritoriality was a result of the so-called unequal treaties signed between China and multiple nations. Before the unequal treaties, actually even before 1900, very little written in Chinese law addressed the regulation of private economic activity. Okay, foreign merchants became increasingly dissatisfied with the state of Qing dynasty's legal system and lack of commercial code. So there has been a lot of lobbying efforts by British merchants to have more legal presence and institutional presence in China. And that led to, in a way, the Opium War and the establishment of the Nanking Treaty. And the Nanking Treaty introduced extraterritoriality to Britain. Basically, foreign nationals and the businesses in China, right, for example, in this case, British businesses, would be subject to no laws in China, but rather the laws of Britain. And that quickly was expanded to other nations as more treaties were formed. And later on, it had a huge influence on the establishment of Chinese own legal institutions, especially China's first company law in 1904, because it was an effort on the Chinese side to push the foreign countries to abolish the extraterritorial system, because China would have its own legal system. However, the new company law still suffered weak enforcement, and apparently even today we have issues, but the Chinese and non-Indian businesses would continue to depend on informal institutions and local officials for contract enforcement, property right protection, and dispute settlements. Okay? So this is just a legal chart. So I'm also learning a lot about the law, especially back then. I've had a lot of pressure going through a lot of legal cases back then. So basically, if the defendant is Chinese or non-ET countries, non-treaty nations, you would be subject to the Chinese law, and you would be tried in the mixed court if you were located in the Shanghai concession areas. But if the defendant was from the ET nation, the treaty nation, then you would be subject to your own law back home, and you would be jurisdicted in the consular court. Okay, so Shanghai by early 1900s already had dozens of foreign legal systems in place and dozens of consular courts in place. And so our data would come from the China Home List from 1870 to 1940, about 70 years of data. We would have, at the moment, we have about 23,000 businesses and their owners and non-production employees located in Shanghai concessions. We would have their ID, name, address, country ownership, and the trade status, the products they produce, where they're located, the number and names and titles of their non-production employees. Okay, so this is a chart showing the evolution of number of businesses in Shanghai concession areas. And what you can see is from the end of 19th century, there has been a boom in the number of foreign businesses in Shanghai due to the Maguan Treaty, which specifically allowed foreign firms to invest in Shanghai. Before that, there was a lot of protection against foreign businesses because of the protection offered to the textile sector by Li Hongzhang. So I'm throwing a lot of Chinese names out there because I have no time to translate them. This is the composition of businesses in China, and you can see in concession areas, you can see the British businesses were dominating in the beginning, but quickly contracted, with more Chinese businesses entering the concession, and with more Japanese businesses and more American businesses. Okay? So our first fact shows that firms in the public concession are just larger. Okay? There are a lot more businesses located in the international settlement area. And foreign firms are larger, so if you look at the country ownership, you don't have to read the table. Apologize for the stars and the figures, but basic message here, foreign firms tend to be bigger than domestic firms, in particular the American firms and the Japanese firms, on average. Okay? Industry specialization by country, again, you don't have to read, you just have to listen to me, I guess. American businesses specialize in manufacturing. There's a lot more American firms in manufacturing. Retail businesses tend to be occupied by the French firms, domestic firms. the finance was dominated by the British businesses. The professional services were primarily provided by the British firms. Wholesale was primarily provided by the German firms and the Japanese firms. So there's a lot of specialization going on by nationality. Japanese firms trade the most, and there's more trade in the public concession. Okay, foreign firms have a flatter hierarchy. What does that mean? They tend to have lower share of managers than the Chinese firms, and they tend to have a lower share of domestic managers compared to the Chinese businesses, which is not that surprising. All right, so what is the role of legal institutions in explaining these direct facts, right? So why not explore two aspects of the institutions? One is the legal institution in comparison to the informal institution, right? And the other one is the role of governance, how you govern, right? That depends on where you are located, okay? So our identification strategy will come from time variations in foreign nations' extraterritoriality status. Countries get in and out of the extraterritoriality status, okay? Sometimes because of war in Europe, sometimes because of voluntary abolishment of the ET status. The governance will rely on data like the budget and spending of the councils, and actually we have the weekly meeting minutes of the two councils. It's just incredible amount of data. Too much we don't even know what to do with them. So we have digitized all the meeting minutes of the two councils over this time span. This shows countries' entry and exit out of the extraterritoriality status. Okay, so just to show you, there's a lot of movements, which is our source of variation. So what we find extraterritoriality leads to larger firms. Okay, it's just the dependent variable is employment. Okay, and that's true when we control for firm, nationality fixed effects or year fixed effects. Extraterritoriality leads to more employment in manufacturing. Actually, this result is changing. When we look at finance, this actually becomes, I think it's probably gonna become significant. So extraterritoriality matters to manufacturing, but not so much in retail. Okay? And extraterritoriality leads to more exporters. There are more exporters from nations, from businesses that have extraterritoriality status. We also get data on the rule of law by origin country at the time, right? To see whether a foreign country's rule of law back home would matter to their businesses in Shanghai at the time, because these businesses would be governed by their origin country law, and we find that to be the case. Okay, the rule of law back in the UK, for example, would matter to the British businesses in Shanghai. Okay. Other outcomes of interest. So, like I said, this has been an exhausting effort. Catching up with history, catching up with law at the time. But there are a lot more we can do. We can look at the organization structure. One thing that Chinese businesses consistently, one reason they resisted the formal legal institution, the company law, is their hesitation of registering the company to become a limited company. They just didn't feel comfortable to allow strangers to become shareholders on their companies, so they continue to rely on their social networks for the operation of the companies and for raising funding. But that has limited their ability to raise capital. It also limits their ability to expand their product scope. And once we look at the responses to foreign shocks, we had no shortage of shocks during that period of time. Trade, war, refugee, Great Depression in the US, and interaction between the public and private sector, because we have the council members, okay? Next steps, we want to complete the panel data. This has been a nightmare, but we'll get there. We'll complete the data set. And we want to disentangle the mechanism of institutions' effects, whether it's the property rights channel, the contract enforcement, the trade, or the governance, right? We believe there are some things we can do with the meeting minutes and with the rule of law and the property right measures we have. We also quantify governance. As I mentioned, we have the meeting minutes. We can see exactly how the French concession and the international settlement govern the two areas by the topics they discuss every week during that period of time. We have the SMC election data, annual reports. There is no shortage of data. That's one thing that's really beautiful that period of time. We had extremely detailed and rich data. We also have industry variation in contract intensity. We can see which industries were or benefiting more from the legal institutions, right? Whether it's the contract-intensive industries or it's the technology-intensive industry that benefit more from the legal institutions. Just to give you an example, this is from the meeting minutes, right? So just as a robust check after the Japan's invasion in Shanghai, the discussion of Japan, quickly popped up, right? So this is the meeting minutes, the topics being discussed the year before Japan's invasion. This is the year after Japan's invasion. So the meeting minutes can be a very informative source of information. So I'm stopping here. Sorry for that.
Now we will take some questions. What you got? Okay. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Gracie from the IIEP. So I have some comments on Nancy's paper. So indeed, I like your methodology and the idea very much, but also I just want to point it out. The first thing is the VAT scheme in China is quite fragmented. The 17% is one of the brackets. So overall there are 4 brackets, and over time, indeed, there are also some tax reform. So especially that's the first point. The second one is during that period of time, to be frank, so starting from 1999 to 2001, there are more than one tax reform, including the CIT, VAT, and CIT and VAT base. So I think maybe it's worth trying a little bit more to just rule out the contribution is coming from the tax reform, the other tax reform. So I have some information about the details of the timing and implementation of the different tax reform. So maybe bilaterally I can share some of the information with you. So yeah, that's just some comments on that. Yeah.
Should we respond?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I would love to get the details from you. So we collected some of those, so we collected data on some of those other reforms, and I think what you talked about, the different brackets, and also their exemptions. So I presented a very simple version of the rules and the rebates. So in the paper, we actually control for a lot of the things, so the sector-specific rebates for exports and imports, for example, and then a lot of the other reforms, I think that you talk about are specific for certain sectors or products. So one of the ways that we address it, which is crude, I think, again, it would be great to compare notes and see if we have all the information. But one of the things that we do is we control for sector year fixed effects and even product year fixed effects, and even sector export percentage year fixed effects. And the results are always very similar. I mean, at some point we lose precision because we have so many fixed effects, but the magnitude is really similar.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Kim. I'm from George Washington University. I do have a question to Nancy. So I'm kind of curious about this effect of this VAT tax. How does that affect the industrial organization? About whether there is more manufacturing side actually booming up after this reform. Previously because of this tax implement, and then previously some kind of industry that actually can get by not reporting actually cannot do it anymore. So they may actually just kind of structural transition in the industry-wise. That's one thing that I was curious about. And then the second thing is there some kind of speculation that TFP actually hasn't grown up because some other firm that actually cannot get by again by just reporting their taxation, they just do not come into the market in the first place. So.
Yeah, so I guess both of those questions are very related. I think your question is about, so one thing to note is, I think your question is about do firms respond to the taxes by getting out of the tax base, the formal tax base, right? So one thing to note is that the VAT is actually applied to all firms in China. We just study manufacturing firms because that's the above scale manufacturing firms are who we have good data for. but it's actually applied to all firms, for anyone who has value added. But still, that's a really good question. So the question is, can you get out of the tax base? That's one of the reasons why we're looking at the roster of all registered firms. So looking at our above scale firms isn't that interesting, because to be in it, you have to have more than 5 million RMB or be a state-owned enterprise. You can't get out of being a state-owned enterprise if you're already one. And if you drop below 5 million RMB, we don't really know if that's exiting or that's just shrinking, right? And shrinking, we already see in the data. So that's why we've been collecting data on the registry of all firms. And what we find there is preliminary, the results, I didn't present it, but so far what we see is that these reforms reduce entry and reduce exit. So it looks like they're trying to respond. But they can't get out, because once you're in the system, then it's easier for you to be audited, right? So we don't really expect to see exit, but we do expect to see a decline in entry, and we see that.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm Han Fang from University of Pennsylvania. I have some questions and comments for Maggie. It's really fascinating paper. I know we always learn from history, but this is really a history that we all know but never thought about using it in economic research. Last night, actually, I went online to look for the original copy of the 19 treaty. It's actually quite interesting. Both the Chinese version, English version, and the English version published in China, as well as the one published in London. They are actually somewhat different. But anyway, so I know you have done tons of data, but I was just going to throw out some idea that might add to your more exhausting list. So one thing is, that these kind of contractual contract or property right protection, all these things might lead to some type of production complexity differences, right? So maybe if a contract enforcement is different, maybe some firms will have a longer, larger number of suppliers, things like that, right? Because I don't know if you have information about more details about these firms than the number of employees or things like that. The other thing is maybe worth looking into, what about the actual cases, right? Are there disputes that are submitted to different courts, and how are they, what are the parties involved, and how are they, what are the outcomes, things like that, right? And thirdly, I think when you look at some of the outcomes you reported today, it will be useful to look into whether it's the size differences are coming from growth or just entry, of larger firms. Maybe when an ET became established, became formed, some larger firms from that country enter Shanghai. That I don't know, or whether it's the firms within that's already in Shanghai grow faster upon their home country's gaining ET status. But a lot of interesting things to look at. Seems like we can learn a lot more from this history about the law of institution for firms.
I am Chen from Emory University, and I have a similar comment with Han Ming. So you mentioned a very interesting figure. It say that this different countries have a different specialization of, for example, manufactured by the U.S. and German wholesale. I forgot. So I think this pretty related to some opening to trade, topics that we talk about these days. Is that this country at that time also have a relative comparative advantage at that time, in the world. You can see that it's probably by Shanghai opening, to those countries, and there could be technology transfer or some, know-how transfer, the managerial skill transfer. I wonder, that could perhaps serve a good experiment to take a look at it. Yeah, thanks.
You want to respond?
Sure. So yeah, I agree. We definitely wanted to explore industries' differences in complexity, or as I mentioned, contract intensity, because I think that's one way for us to understand how institutions are affecting firm growth, right? So maybe firms that are more complex, produce complex products, and firms that are more dependent on institutions because of contract intensity would respond more to the institutional differences. That's area we are actually exploring. Legal cases. Someone in Australia actually has put together a list of legal cases. So we are actually at the moment going through all the legal cases and a lot of fascinating cases. Actually, the number of litigations exploded after the establishment of the company law. Growth. So once we are done with with completing the employer-employee data, then we can decompose the growth into within firm growth versus entry versus exit. But that is only after we establish the panel data, right? Country specialization, yeah, we thought about comparing the specialization pattern in Shanghai with the specialization pattern of those countries at that time, right? It would be interesting to see if the same specialization pattern we observe across countries in their countries holds in Shanghai at the same time, right? Technology transfer, yeah, so that's why we think we can do a lot more with the labor linkage between firms, because we observe the employee, right, non-production employee. And we know how they move across firms and how they transition between public sector and the private sector, the SMC to firms. So they bring the technologies, and they bring the institutions, they bring the connections with them as they transition between different places.
Just along those lines, will you be looking at institutional effectiveness? For example, in terms of investment disputes, are they consistent in terms of rule of law?
Yeah, so I mean, it's very difficult to measure effectiveness, right? So the only way we can, we are thinking is to look at the minutes and to see how much attention they have been given to contracts, how much attention they have been given to, intellectual property rights or disputes. So that's a source of information for us. We haven't explored much.
Yes, please.
There was a question.
I'm Alka Bhatnagar. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, so private citizen now. But my interest has been on studying this Shanghai concessions and the opium wars and the interrelations between Afghanistan, India, and China. How does it go now? And where can I, as a private citizen now, do more research? Would it be the Library of Congress, or would it be the British Library? So in your opinion?
Certainly both, yeah.
And in English, not in Chinese. I do not speak Chinese.
Yeah, so there's a lot of information that's been digitized, and I think they're available in both the British and the Congress library here. For example, one of my co-authors has been borrowing books from the British library, and we have been getting books from the French side. We have gotten books from the Chinese side. So there is a wealth of information, and that's one thing. In fact, I think the customs data back then, because we are also digitizing the customs data, the customs data back then, in some ways, are more detailed than the current data. We have the transaction level cargo customs data by port city in China at the time with the rest of the world. So.
Over here.
And while I'm waiting for the question, the customs at that time was controlled by the British for that.
Right.
Hi, I'm Paul Tyson, also retired FSO of New England College. Some questions about this. Have you looked at the State Department history? Have you looked at the Marine Corps history? And did you look at the expropriation settlements when we normalized with China in '79, because it was $50 million for Shanghai Power and Light?
Yeah, right.
Oh, well, I think if you look at the back bearings, I know it's outside your period of time, it gives you an idea of what was American and what was there just at the time.
Yeah, we have looked into State Department documents, but we have not gone to 1970s because our period stopped in 1942. That's where our data set ends.
Any other questions? I believe this one right here.
Hello, I'm Zhang Hong from USDA Economic Research Service. So I have a question for you both. So the first question for Nancy is, the value-added tax is always quite complicated to calculate. So I wonder It seems like you only use the China census data, so I wonder if you consider the imported material, imported inputs, and what will be the impact if you count the imported inputs to the value-added tax? Will they increase or decrease or unclear? And then I also have a question for Maggie. So quite interesting topic and amazing data. So I also had a paper on trade and institution in China, so using provincial data. So at that time, I remember in order to control the indigeneity issue, we used the colonial history for the province in China. So I wonder, for your research, would you worry about indigeneity issue and the selection of firms into different zones in Shanghai? Thank you.
So that's a great question. So imports and exports matter a lot for the calculation of VATs, because you're exempt, they're VAT exempt.
Yeah,
And
especially
so-
after the WTO.
Yeah, that's right. I think so. So I think people think that the WTO had like a ubiquitous, one formula for all effect on import-exports. But actually what we find is that import-export rebates varied by sector by year before and after the WTO. But in any case, we're actually, when we calculate the VAT, we account for it. Because our data actually reports the amount of imported inputs or the amount of exports for sales. So we actually take all that into account when we calculate VATs. So I provided a really simple formula of sales minus deductibles, and that's true, but it's really a matter of what counts as sales and what counts as deductibles, and that we're able to count it. Maggie?
Yeah, so about indigeneity, sure. I mean, it's a central question in our empirical analysis. When we try to identify the effect of ET, extraterritoriality, I think we have a less of an issue because we are exploring the time variations within a country's status, right? And their status in terms of extraterritoriality changes for reasons like, their the war, and their it's a lot more macro decisions. But in terms of location, in which concession to enter, right? That's a clearly endogenous decision on the firm side. So we are exploring the concession border of the French concession because, as many of you know, the French concession gradually expanded during those decades. So there were firms that used not to belong to the French concession, but were basically included into the French concession because of the expansion. And the expansion was done by paving roads and effectively claiming the territory and then later gaining the recognition for the ownership. So it's out of the control of the firms, but we are using that as an identification strategy to establish the causal effect of concession location.
Richard, sir?
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in that Shanghai history. Were there any repercussions during World War I against the German concession? Because all the other concessions were allied. And I know in 1910, I believe China was the third largest manufacturer in the world. So was there, you can't say, but sort of a net positive effect on all these concessions on the growth of the Chinese economy?
Yeah, so Germany didn't have a concession really per se, right? Germany was sort of initially part of the international settlement area, but Germany had extraterritoriality status until the war, right? When the war broke, Germany basically lost the extraterritoriality status. So there was definitely, the change in the membership.
What about the effect on China as a whole?
That's what we're trying to quantify here. I'm not sure I can say something too aggregate at this point because we're using firm level data, but that's exactly what we're trying to examine.
Yes, please.
Hi, Windsor. Professor Thomas from WTU. I have a comment for Maggie. There is another city of Tianjin in the north. The situation could be very similar to the situation in Shanghai. Could you use it as a comparison point?
We had to make our choice when it comes to digitizing, 100 something books of firm directory. We decided to pick Shanghai. Also because Shanghai had much better data than Tianjin in many other aspects. But yes, Tianjin had a similar context. But I think the growth phenomenon was much more prominent in Shanghai, perhaps because of institutional differences or enforcement differences.
Okay, I've been told by the Master of Ceremonies that we need to wrap up. So could you please thank our speakers?